The 150th Anniversary Signet Classic Edition of Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman. Foreword. For the past 10 years, always on a Monday evening early in June, New York City's Poets House has held its annual Brooklyn Bridge Poetry Walk. Typically, several hundred people gather on the Manhattan side of the bridge, where relevant poems by Hart Crane, Marianne Moore, and others are read by a number of high-profile poets. Then the group, bearing placards and programs, begins its walk across the bridge, pausing under the first cathedral-like arch for more poetry readings, much to the puzzlement of some of the passing joggers and bicyclists. The high point of the event is always the concluding reading performed on the Brooklyn side by Galway Kinnell of Walt Whitman's Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, the ferry that was made obsolete by the very bridge that his reading celebrated. Standing on his back to the East River, it rushes along on one of its tidal runs, and beyond it, the Manhattan skyline now featuring the stunning gaps where the World Trade Center once towered. Kinnell intones the poem with full-throated ease and brings the listeners into a noticeably eerie sense of connection to Whitman. This is the poem, you might remember, that insistently addresses readers and listeners of the future who will stand here one day just where Whitman stood. And you that shall cross from shore to shore years hence are more to me, and more in my meditations than you might suppose. Whitman aims his poem at a posterity that, now as the sun weakens over New Jersey on this early summer evening, includes his contemporary group of poetry readers who are standing by the same river he so frequently crossed. Others will see the islands large and small 50 years hence. Others will see them as they cross, the sun half an hour high. 100 years hence, or ever so many 100 years hence, others will see them, will enjoy the sunset, the pouring in of the flood tide, the falling back to the sea of the ebb tide. By making its listener an essential part of the drama, the poem draws us into a kind of prophetic conspiracy with Whitman and makes us wonder for a moment how he knew we would be here. The sensation of Whitman's physical presence is a dramatic reminder of one of the more striking innovations that Whitman brought to poetry, that is, a radical unheard of level of intimacy. It avails not, time nor place, distance avails not. I am with you, you men and women of a generation or ever so many generations hence. Just as you feel when you look on the river and sky, so I felt. No poet I know prior to Whitman had ever used the second-person address in quite this way. The you or thou that appears in the long tradition of English love poetry, prominently in the Elizabethan sonnet, always meant the beloved. Under the influence of this inheritance, readers of contemporary American poetry tend to take any unspecified you as a romantic address. Mention you in a poem and your reader will see valentines and love arrows in flight. But in Whitman, the you is you, the reader, holding the book in your hands. You. The you is a beloved only in the sense that Whitman wishes to circumscribe his readers with its outreaching cosmic love. This freshly intense intimacy begins in 1855 with the first edition of Leaves of Grass. So innovative was this authorial coziness, it may be seen as analogous to the radical breaking of the theatrical barriers separating actors and audiences in the heyday of the theater of the absurd. Just as an actor might stride into the seats, grab a spectator by the lapel, and drag him on stage, so Whitman steps off the page and into his reader's domestic and psychic space, often closing in from a number of angles. He threatens to overwhelm the reader's own identity by asserting, "What I assume you shall assume, for every item belonging to me as good belongs to you." He boasts shamelessly, "Stop this day and night with me, and you shall possess the origin of all poems." He issues grandiose commands. "It is time to explain myself. Let us stand up." He confides, "I might not tell everyone, but I will tell you." He shows the way. "Each man and woman of you I lead upon a knoll, my left hand hooking you around the waist, my right hand pointing to landscapes of continents in the public road." And he whispers and beckons seductively, "Love with me on the grass. Stop the loose from your throat. Loose the stop from your throat." Not words, not music or rhyme I want. Not custom or lecture, not even the best. Only the lull I like, the hum of your velvet voice. The academic question as to whether this bold and cozy poetic voice is identical to that of the biographical Walt Whitman. Native Long Islander, simply perhaps a persona, melts away in the heat of this new tone of familiarity as it issues directly forth from the man who speaks the poem and who is in the process of exhibiting himself to the world. The notorious Samuel Hollier, drawing on the book's frontispiece, based on a photograph by Gabriel Harrison, shows the poet as rough, the antithesis of the literary figure of the day, who would have been pictured in a vested suit in a book-lined room, not outdoors with his shirt open and his hat cocked. This is the half-invented but wholly felt character that Whitman summoned forth to deliver his poem. If a novelist must invent many characters to fill the chapters of a book, a poet must invent only one. That is, the voice through which he or she speaks. Whitman's character, who is the vocal extension of that photograph, is a composite of many men, mostly ones met on the street or on the ferry, whom he described in his notebooks with such adjectives as independent, coarse, free-spirited, strong, sensitive, amiable, and reflective. In short, an American amalgam of fierce and contradictory elements. The swelling, libidinous ego of the poem seems determined to disarm the reader's critical responses and to overwhelm him with a radical kind of audacity, a verbal bear hug. Remember, this is the poet who rendered Randall Jarrell as close to speechless as he ever had been in the face of a literary text. In his article on Leaves of Grass, all Jarrell could do was tip his critic's hat and proclaim that Whitman reaches a point at which criticism seems not only unnecessary, but absurd. He deals with Whitman's faults by declaring in italics that they don't matter. Just as revolutionary in 1855 is the intimate voice of the poem, ranging as it does from whispers to barbaric yops, quote-unquote, was the poem's apparent disregard for the conventions of inherited form. Leaves of Grass is indeed the first poem in English to flout the deeply ingrained etiquette of both regular meter and end rhyme. As such, it exists as a poem without borders. The sonnet, to pick an extreme example, must exclude everything but the 14 lines, strictly speaking the 140 syllables necessary for its expression. Whitman's poem, on the other hand, allows all to flow in. All trades, scenes, people, places, tools, impulses, memories, projections, wishes, seasons. The poem is not so much a rejection of form as a demolishing of boundaries, both the outer walls of the poem, which would keep it separate from the world, and the inner walls, which would partition the poem's many elements. It is a poem without walls and without a clock to limit the length of its duration. Was it this free-for-all feel of the poem, or its unabashedly sexual speaker, that prompted James Russell Lowell, one of the ruling trinominate class of poets, to pitch this copy of Leaves of Grass into a roaring fireplace? And that inspired another contemporary to proclaim, if this is not poetry, then it is something greater than poetry. Of course, for all the look and sound of spontaneity that the poem conveys, Leaves of Grass does possess a distinct underlying form. Whitman seems relatively artless as he sings his long American love song, but in fact he was a compulsive reviser, an inveterate journal keeper, as well as a dedicated collector of words. His poems seem to step outside the institution of literature, according to Paul Zweig, but only because it shows no sign of the influence of Tennyson, William Cullen Bryant, or other likely predecessors, but rather that of the Bible, the raging prose of Thomas Carlyle, and the Italian opera. Instead of being stabilized by end rhyme, the poem uses repetition at the beginning of lines, anaphora, to hold together its diverse ingredients. And instead of the ticking of the iambic metronome, the pulse of natural speech combines with the cascading movement of biblical rhetoric to give the poem its enthralling cadence. Whitman described his own sense of poetic rhythm organically as the free growth of metrical laws that bud from them as unerringly and loosely as lilacs and roses on a bush, and take shapes as compact as the shapes of chestnuts and oranges. Whitman's drastic innovations became even more interesting when placed in a historical context. In 1798, over half a century before the 1855 edition of Leaves of Grass, Wordsworth argued for more ordinary language for poetry. And over half a century after 1855, Pound insists that poets break free from the iambic yoke. Situated midway between the beginnings of English Romanticism and High Modernism, Whitman's bold enactment of natural diction and cadence makes Woodward's and Pound's declarations seem like theoretical proposals. Whitman stands isolated in the middle of a century whose literary tradition he'd never fit into. Whitman gives no sign of being influenced by Wordsworth and company, and Pound gives Whitman only grudging credit for breaking new wood in a poem that begins, "I make a pact with you, Walt Whitman. I have detested you long enough." His ambivalent essay, What I Feel About Walt Whitman, admits that Whitman is America, but adds that he is not an artist, for he lacks reticence and restraint, quote-unquote. Pound even puts distance between himself and his poetic ancestor by claiming to prefer a collar and a dress shirt to Whitman's bohemian get-up. All who follow Whitman seem obliged to acknowledge him, and yet for every poet he inspires, there is another poet whom he just makes nervous. Indeed, the most distinguishing aspect of Whitman as a literary figure is the various varied kinds of influence he has had on the American poets who follow him, Pound being one of the more cantankerous. In the century and a half since the first edition of Leaves of Grass, Whitman has become such a pervasive part of American literature that his influence, as assiduously looked for, can be found just about anywhere. He is the male pillar, Dickinson the female, that supports the temple of the 19th century American poetry, and from that position his influence spreads in all directions. The extent of his alleged sway is so wide and diverse as to be stretched sometimes beyond the borders of sense. Critics have found traces of his spirit alive in Dylan Thomas and D.H. Lawrence, in Bruce Springsteen and Patti Smith, in William Carlos Williams and Jory Graham, and in Hamlin Garland and Fernando Pessoa. Whitman is a torchbearer for socialists and viralists and labor activists. And let us not forget his purported impact on the Harlem Renaissance and the Native American poetry movement. The Whitman web has been cast so wide it is difficult to find anyone swimming free of it. Whitman's influence has been assigned so loosely it might be able to distinguish between poets who recognize Whitman as a literary father and poets who use Whitman as a stylistic model by directly imitating and even appropriating his poetic innovations. In Walt Whitman, The Measure of His Song, Ed Folsom and his co-editors make it clear that few poets have been immune to paying some kind of attention to Whitman. In the 19th century, many wrote tributes to him as an American icon. Ironically, most of these tributes were written in just the kind of stiff formal meters whose mold Whitman had cracked. Some penned elegies, or, like Swinburne, hailed him as a patron saint of human liberty. O strong swinged soul with prophetic, lips hot with souls as with swords, make us to music to be with us, as a word from the world's heart warm, to sail the dark as the sea with us, full sailed out singing the storm. Worshipful eulogies stand along imaginary debates, and of course parodies and caricatures. Whitman acts as a magnet for a host of reactions. The long and varied list of writers who felt compelled to respond to Whitman in prose would include Willa Cather, Sherwood Anderson, T.S. Eliot, Muriel Rukeyser, and Borges, to name a few familiar names. Carl Sandburg called Whitman the only established epic poet in America. D.H. Lawrence considered his one identity a prison of horrors, but he also dubbed Whitman the greatest of Americans, a poet who has gone further in actual living expression than any man. Langston Hughes put together an edition and a biographical version of Whitman. The Lord of God drew a nostalgic poem to him, and Pessoa not only drew on the rolling pace of Whitman's style, but mirrored Whitman's powers of empathy by claiming an identity with Walt himself. You know that I am you, and you're happy about it. Not yet not until Hard Crane can a poet be seen as feeling the anxiety of Whitman's direct stylistic influence. The Cape Hatteras section of the bridge stands as a note to Whitman, in which the poet is theatrically addressed. O Walt! A sense of thee hover in me now, as thou a gestion's lee-jack. Crane calls out and finally ends the poem by placing his hand in Whitman's. No, never to let go. My hand, in yours. Walt Whitman so. But a greater tribute to Whitman lies in Crane's imitation of the rolling motion, the open-windowed consciousness, and the declamatory tone of Leaves of Grass. O sinewy silver biplane, nudging the wind's withers. There from Kill Devil's Hill at Kitty Hawk, two brothers in their twin ship left the doom. Warping the gale, the right wind westlers veered capeward. Then bleeding the wind's flank banked and spun, with ciphers risen from prophetic script, with Marathon's new set between the stars. It is hard to imagine such lines being written without the prior existence of Whitman, but a heavier stylistic debt is owed by Allen Ginsberg, whose early poetry shows an almost parasitic dependency on Whitman. A supermarket in California embraces Whitman as its model and its subject. Removed from the open road of the 19th century and placed in a modern supermarket of the 20th, Whitman appears as a childless, lonely old grubber, poking among the meats in the refrigerator and eyeing the grocery boys. He is transformed into a surrealist shopper who asks who killed the pork chops and what priced bananas. In 1955, at Sixth Gallery in San Fran, exactly 100 years after the first edition of Leaves of Grass, Ginsberg publicly performed Howl for the first time. The poet's indebtedness to Whitman was so striking that Ferlinghetti, publisher of City Lights Books, later wrote Ginsberg a note that mimicked Emerson's famous lines of encouragement to Whitman. "I greet you at the beginning of a great career. When do I get the manuscript?" From its first exhalations, Howl conveys the open-ended, roving spirit of Whitman's great poem. The long lines, the breathing rhythm, the run of free associations, and the reliance on anaphora and to ritualize the poem are unashamedly indebted to Leaves of Grass. The overall feel of Howl, and particularly its theme of homoerotic love, will leave no doubt that Whitman is Ginsberg's poetic father. But while Whitman's a poem of celebration, Ginsberg's is a poem of social criticism and a proclamation of a new radical consciousness, both lifted and tormented by drugs. Whitman unites everything American under the belief in a single identity. Ginsberg divides America into the outsiders and the establishment, the angel-headed hipsters, quote-unquote, versus the squares of Wall Street. Ginsberg issues in this emerging generation of beat visionaries against the backdrop of corporate and civic order, the narcotic tobacco haze of capitalism. Unlike the open-hearted embrace of Leaves of Grass, Howl's a poem of protest whose opening rant gives way to a litany against the tyrannical Semitic deity of Moloch, here the god of greed, government, and war, industry, and bombs. Whitman's poem ends with an image of the patient poet who has stopped somewhere to wait for the reader to catch up with him. Ends with a disturbing entreaty to the mental patient Carl Solomon, straight-jacketed victim of electroshock. These differences between the two poems are hardly surprising, given the intervening 100 years and the Cold War context of Ginsberg's outcry. The kinds of imagery deployed in the poems vividly reflect two distinct sensibilities. Whitman's images are clearly visual. Ginsberg's are often surreal, distorting the kind of syntactic funhouse mirror. In Whitman, winter wolves bark amid wastes of snow and icicle trees. In Ginsberg, Beatles listen to the crack of doom on the hydrogen jukebox and plunge themselves under meat trucks looking for an egg. The sharp clarity of Whitman's imagery is an essential feature of Leaves of Grass, especially in the way that the poet embeds these discrete, stable images in the loose, rhetorical flow of the poem. The vocal wave of the poem keeps tumbling forward, propelled by an euphoric repetition and the sheer power of Whitman's declarations, but the poem is dotted with tiny scenes that act as still pictures within the larger movie of the poem. The forward roll of the poem, which evokes the cadences of the Bible and Blake's prophetic works, is periodically checked by glimpses of precise scenes like frames in a halted film, or more apt for the times, pictures viewed in a stereopticon. Taken from some of the earlier sections of the poem, here is a sample of such concise haiku-like images. The butcher boy puts off his killing clothes or sharpens his knife at the stall in the market. The brother holds firmly the reins of the 4 horses. He blocks swags underneath on its tight-over chain. The brood of the turkey hen and she with her half-spread wings. The mate stands braced in the whaleboat lance and the harpooner ready. The duck shooter walks by silent and cautious stretches. The clean-haired Yankee girl works with her sewing machine or in the factory or mill. As the fare collector goes through the train, he gives notice by the jingling of loose change. Given Whitman's habit of entering daily scenes and images in a notebook, much of the poem would seem to be a stitching together of his many recorded observations. Whitman even called his notebook entries the ABC of his long poem. And he remarked elsewhere on the abundance of ubiquity in the world's imagery. Every hour of the day and night, and every acre of the earth and shore, Every point or patch of the sea and sky is full of pictures. Such is the practice of everyday journal-toting writer. What is unique about Whitman's practice is how much such moments of keen observation are made to fit into the larger, more sweeping operatic movement of the poem. Whitman expressed the wish to avoid all the stock touches, the poeticisms of his day, and he achieves this precisely through the combination of wave and picture, movie and photograph, which accounts for this poem's unprecedented tempo and texture. Leaves of Grass has left many critics speechless, an accomplishment in itself. Randall Jower was neither the first nor the last to notice that the poem tends to resist critical analysis. Proponents of the new criticism virtually ignored Whitman's existence, but because his open-throated singing lacked tension, irony, and paradox, which had become the key signs of literary value. And at the time when speaker and persona had become critical bywords, Whitman's dropping of any literary mask struck many as nothing short of embarrassing. Whitman would have denied admission to the confessional school of poetry because he lacked the psychic pain to qualify, and he would be too considered expensive, and so too chatty for the adherents to deep image. But today Whitman is among the most approachable of poets. While he retains his iconic status in the American literary transition, he is a poet who has finally found and the kind of wide readership that his expansive voice, not to mention his self-advertising, sought to assemble. Whitman believed that the greatness of poetry was directly proportionate to the greatness of its audience, and it's safe to say, 150 years after his explosive publication, that his audience continues to grow not only in greater numbers but also in the depth of their comprehension, their gratitude, and their empathy. At a time when built-in nihilism and deconstruction is brought to its inevitable end, and when academics and theorists are returning to the long-neglected literary texts themselves, Whisper, Whitman will be found waiting for them. If they want him again, they'll have to only look under their boot soles. Billy Collins.